Good evening. By me, it's Wednesday. By you, it should be mostly Shabbos, Thanksgiving weekend. Welcome to the seventh part of this current winter series lecture, 2020 to 2021. The name of the series is Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the 1980s or the Mid-80s. Tonight is the seventh lecture, entitled Reagan Without Reagan, the USA and the State of Israel Part 2. I want to start, as I always do, by thanking our series sponsor, the Lehman family. Liz Lehman has a special birthday coming up. Don't ask me how I know. I want to thank also our specific sponsors tonight, which is Michael and Jeffrey. Let's leave it at that. In honor of a recent wedding that I had the privilege to perform, Sara and Shlomo, and for refuah shleimah for a certain Savta. B'daya l'chakim b'bermizo. I always want to thank our tech team. Yehuda Leib over here schlepping out at night to make this all happen for you and put together a whole electronic rigmarole. Don't ask me to explain. To Howard Elbaum, who of course fearlessly puts out the PowerPoint, and to Yossi Wetstein, who's going to wave the Merlin wand and actually turn this into something decent. I do want to add, as I always do, that thank God our current series is sponsored. Some of you are nice enough to ask about different sponsorships. We have a podcast going on every week, and if you're interested, just email me or contact me about sponsoring some of the podcasts. And finally, as I always mention, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because that's supposed to be the elixir for everything. That's what I'm told. Now, without any further ado, we'll get into part two. We're talking about Reagan and Reagan. We're talking about the second administration of Ronald Reagan. I cannot forbear, before we get serious, to have a little comic relief. I found, I told you, Reagan comes from, Ronald Reagan comes from Hollywood. Hollywood is, among other things, a Jewish place. That's not all it is. It's one of the things, a Jewish place. And therefore, you're very comfortable with Jewish comedians, Jewish shows. Look at this. Here's Don Rickles from yesteryear. Different America. Different time in America, where people could take jokes. Roasting Ronald Reagan and getting it back.
The greatest thing I can say to Governor Reagan or Reagan, whatever they call, what do they call you, Governor? The greatest moment I remember in your career was when you said to Pat O'Brien, the Gipper is dying. And I got an uncle that thought it was a fish. Now, the Gentile gentleman here had no idea. A kipper. That's a Jewish fish. Don't be dumb. I hate a dumb guy. He wouldn't be governor if my people didn't go, okay.
And then there are some men who achieve fame and go beyond that to become veritable household words. Now, Don Rickles is such a man. He has become a household word. The kind they erase in X-rated movies.
You see what I mean? Now, by the way, it's a different America, a different time. You could tell jokes, and you could rib a politician, he wouldn't freak out. I like Donald Trump, he couldn't handle that. You know what I'm saying? He couldn't take that kind of ribbing. So Reagan's very comfortable in his skin with Jews. Now, more seriously, we were talking about the Jordanian option last week, which was at the center of the Middle Eastern policy of the second Ronald Reagan administration, which was at least in the years 1985 to 1987. Indeed, these were the last years of that policy, a policy goal that in retrospect lasted for 20 years, from 1967 to 1987, and then it disappeared. Here, if you look at the next one, you see President Reagan with King Hussein, who was coming all the time to the White House. And the idea is, can we get this Jordanian option in play? Before I explain what I mean, I have to say, after I wrote this all up, I looked in the newspaper tonight, the internet. The Jordanian option is being revived in the press as we speak. It's funny. Geschichte chazert zechibur. Things that we thought were long buried and dead may have a strange revival. But then again, we have a new administration in Washington and coming in, and that's going to radically change matters as well. So I know the past. I don't claim to be able to tell the future. By the Jordanian option, you simply mean that Israel pulls out on the West Bank and gives it to Jordan. In addition, in exchange for which, there's no PLO state. Jordan is a normal country, and really, honestly, has a peace with Israel. And so you have two countries, like it used to be before the '67 war, except that before the '67 war, Israel and Jordan were technically at war. Now they'd be at peace. And instead of, for example, Jews not being able to go into visit the West Bank and the holy sites places that they could, on the other hand, there'd be no Jewish settlements there at all. And this highly controversial proposition is what I intend to explain right now. This strange policy was based on Israel's perception, at least the Israeli left, the Zionist left's perception, that Jordan would be Israel's policeman. This concept of finding an Arab policeman to help keep Israel secure became a key element in the thinking of the Labor Party in Israel and the Zionist left in general, as we see in the next slide, down to the present day. And I predict, even though I just said I'm not predicting the future, but I think that this will be an interesting element in the new incoming administration with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Indeed, once it became clear in the late 1980s, as we shall see, that there was no Jordanian option, Peres and Rabin would persuade themselves, we know in hindsight, in the 1990s, that Yasser Arafat, of all people, would agree to be Israel's policeman. Let's go to the next slide. This, of course, was wishful thinking. And so Rabin hoped that Arafat will keep Israel safe by suppressing the bad guys and other fantasies. In other words, this was completely wrong. But you couldn't persuade anybody at that time. And if you're old enough, as many of us are, to remember the Oslo era, you could get shot for bringing that up. Anyway, this point of view or policy was based on the harsh reality that Israel, a country like Israel, now listen closely, has no effective real solution to the problem of asymmetric attacks from failed states and from what I call Stalingrads, which is like, the Israel and the Hamas today, okay? What do you do if you're a country and they conduct raids and terrorist attacks from the nearby territory, and there's no government for you to talk to, or the government can't do anything about it or won't? And so what do you end up doing? You're dealing with a failed state, so there's nobody in charge. Or, equally bad or worse, you're dealing with what I call Stalingrad, which is, for example, Hamas is holed up in Gaza, and the Hezbollah is holed up, as we all know, in southern Lebanon. And they say, come and get us, because we're dug in for a Stalingrad battle, and we'll take down a lot of Israelis with us, and it becomes a situation Israel does not wish to engage in. But on the other hand, you can't tolerate the continued rocket attacks and bombing attacks and terrorist attacks. So what do you do? The whole point of these kind of attacks is to make life unbearable for Israel, and then the Jews will say, we'll go home and leave. Hear what I said? They go home and leave. Because to the Arabs, they're going to go home to Europe or something like that. Make life unbearable. That's the whole principle of terrorist attacks. Now, so from Israel's point of view, listen, if Israel had its way, there'd be New Zealand. There'd be an island surrounded by 1,000 miles of water and Gomernim. But Israel's stuck in the Middle East, not, as Humphrey used to point out, in the Midwest. So from Israel's point of view, the ideal solution is to be surrounded by Arab states which are not failed states, which act de facto as Israel's border police and prevent incursions into Israel from their territory. Hear that? I didn't say countries that are at peace with Israel. That's good too. But at least for day-to-day living, what they call in Israel current security as opposed to basic security. I think that's the technical terms. For current security, you need the country next door not to permit terrorist attacks into your country for whatever reason. As it happens, Jordan has been this way since 1970. There have been no attacks, really, from Jordan to Israel, terrorist attacks. That's quite a statement I'm making. You probably don't realize this. I repeat, from Jordan itself into Israel after 1970. Syria, of all places, has been like this, certainly under the Assads, especially the old man Assad. He was always planning to wipe out Israel. He was getting every kind of A-bomb and biological bombs and things like this to wipe out Israel. But border with Golan was not a terrorist border. It's interesting. And Egypt has been this way since 1974. In other words, after the Yom Kippur War, Sadat You didn't have, I'm talking about before Reagan came along even, you no longer had Fedayeen raids from the Egyptian-held territory into Israel proper, right? So if we go to the next slide, you'll see my point when I say both King Hussein on the left and Hafiz Assad on the right were de facto Mishmar HaGavul for Israel for different reasons. You know, Jordan did it for reasons we'll see soon, and Assad did it because he had other fish to fry, with his country blowing up around him all the time, and he was planning to knock out Israel with help from the Soviets in a conventional or unconventional war. Now, Lebanon, for example, has not been a state like this. It's a failed state in the sense it cannot control. Ever since 1967, and I've explained this earlier years, Lebanon does not have a government that could control incursions into Israel. That's why it's been a perpetual sore. It's like a blistering wound. All Israel can do, as we know, is bomb Lebanon from the air and cause a lot of pain. But is that enough? And anyway, let's go to the next slide. Ever since the last 15, 20 years, as Israel has learned painfully, Lebanon has an equalizer now. Take a look at this. The Hezbollah is in Lebanon. I know you know that. Hezbollah's military strength is somewhat based on the quantity and quality of the rockets they possess, which they use against their primary enemy, Israel. The group's strategy against Israel uses rockets as offensive weaponry combined with light infantry and anti-armored units to defend their firing positions in southern Lebanon. Now here comes the point. This doggone Hezbollah has up to 150,000 rockets. So if Israel today bombs Lebanon, and they're careful not to, if Hezbollah wants to, they go like back in 2006 or whatever, and launch 100,000 rockets at Israel. Remember, they plastered the country. And then what does Israel do? So it's no longer a Kedai for Israel to go and bomb them. On the other hand, Israel can't stand it if they start launching constant terrorist attacks for Lebanon to Israel. And so it's a balance of terror, right? Meaning it's been quiet since the last Lebanon war, but everybody knows it could change in a second. So it's extreme tension. And to be frank, an Israeli living up there in Kiryat Shmona, wherever, right next to the Lebanon border, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, because nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So this is the facts of life. With these facts in front of us, let us return to the question, why was the Jordanian option up for discussion in the 1980s? Why was Ronald Reagan really into this? George Shultz was really into this. And Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, mainly Peres, who was the prime minister, as I pointed out. Peres was elected prime minister as a result of the 1984 elections. And after all the verhandling with the coalition politics, and he made a coalition with the Likud, remember, but he was the prime minister. As I started to explain last week, the country of Jordan really had nothing to do with Palestine other than geographical proximity. I mean, with the Arabs on the Jewish side of Jordan, that's the Palestinians, as you and I call them. The other side is called Jordanians. There's two different groups. The British, as we saw, simply gave Abdullah a fairly large and empty, sparsely populated piece of karka as a political move after the First World War. However, I told you, Prince Abdullah never gave up his dreams, his hopes of becoming king of the whole Middle East, or at least a big chunk of it. Abdullah always wanted to be king of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and no, not Iraq. All in concert with the British, as you see in the next slide, right? This Abdullah guy, they had big plans. He said, I don't want to mess the British up. I want to do it together with the British. I'm actually the British's best friend, so they should let me become king of the Middle East. Now, as I tried to tell you, Abdullah always eyed Palestine. And he was always looking for ways to take it over. Because he was always loyal to the British government, the government in England, actually would have made him king of all Palestine if not for the Balfour Declaration. Believe me, if they hadn't made the mistake as they came to view it, of promising Palestine as a national home for the Jews, then what would happen, Stamazoi, Labid, after the First World War, they would combine Jordan and Palestine into one mandate, which they had, and they would give it to Abdullah. He'd be the king of the guns of business, and he was a pretty liberal guy, I'm serious, and he would have been okay to the Jews over there, but it would be an Arab country. And because the British had been to the Balfour Declaration, they couldn't do that. But they wanted to. By the way, the Aguda in those years, and the Neturah Karta, as it came to be called, favored this. If you go back to the 1920s and 30s, especially before the 1920 Hebron massacres, 29 Hebron massacres, I'm not happy to say this, but the Aguda, as it was so constituted at that time, and what comes to be called in the Torah Carta, they actually wanted King Abdullah to become king of all Palestine. Because they're against a Zionist state for all kind of reasons. To the Zionists, of course, as we see in the next slide, this was treason, and that's why they shot the political representative of the Torah Carta, which is Dr. Jacob Dahan. I'm sorry, I forgot this. Because Abdullah was always interested in Palestine, they have Abdullah's representatives negotiating with Chaim Weizmann over there, and some of the other leaders next to Weizmann is Ar Lazarov, who was the head of the Jewish Agency, and each one was trying to outwit the other. The Zionists were trying to get permission to set up Jewish settlements on the Jordan side, and Abdullah was trying to get ways to get the Zionists to agree that he should become king of the whole Palestine, with civil rights being guaranteed to the Zionists. Each one was trying to mess the other over. But as I tell you again, let's go to the next slide. There was a time in the early 1920s when the Aguda, if I can use that term, Chaim Sonnenfeld, people like that, wanted to play politics, and because they were so opposed to any possible state of Israel, which they saw in various ways as a horrible thing, they were convinced that the state of Israel would wipe out from Judaism. I know it didn't turn out that way. I'm talking the way they thought about that time. And second of all, some of these people had like Satmar attitude, which is got away from Mashiach. So they went so far as to kiss up to Abdullah and start to talk to the British press and others about setting up a Jewish propaganda in favor of an Arab state in Palestine instead of a Jewish state. And so they killed him. It's a famous political assassination. That's Dr. Jacob Dahan, who was a BT. He was a Dutch guy, he was gay, he was this, he was a big writer, and so on and so forth. And then became frum when he came to Israel. He flipped and became secretary of Chaim Sonnenfeld. He was gunned down because they said, I guess, we don't want any Jews who are going to bring in Abdullah. Now, I'm just bringing that up to tell you that all during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, what we call Jordan was eyeing Eretz Yisrael, the other side of Palestine, our side of Palestine. And what the Jews hoped would end up a state of Israel there, they had hoped that time be all Jewish. Abdullah was looking at for his point of view. And this is why, since he was such a pragmatic guy, Abdullah agreed, he was the only one who agreed to the partition of Palestine in 1937, the Peel Commission. Look at the next map. I spoke about this many years ago. For 5 minutes in the late 1930s, there was a chance that the British might set up a Jewish state. Small, it's that tan color over here on the upper part of Israel. So it's nowhere near as large as the state of Israel today. But it would have been a state of Israel in 1938. It would have saved half the 6 million Jews. Let's put it that way, right? But look at the Arab part. What is that, pink or something? Look at the Arab part. Abdullah said, I favor this plan and I'll be the king of the Arab part. See, what I doubled the size of his kingdom. See, he was very much a pragmatist. And I'm sure he thought, once I get that part, maybe I'll somehow or other take over the Jewish part also. Ben Gurion, for his part, says, once we get the Jewish state in that small chelik of Israel, we'll get the other part also. That's how people thought. The problem was that by this time, by the late 30s, there had developed among significant parts of the Palestine Arab population, a national movement of their own, which hated and rejected Abdullah. This segment of the population, which was not the majority, I want to point that out, but which was active and energetic, they're the ones who launched the great Intifada of the mid and late 1930s. The Intifada, many people don't know anything about this at all, was the original one, the Intifada of the 1930s, was fought against 4 groups. Look at the next slide. They were out to kill these guys. Number 1, the Jews. Number 2, the British. Number 3, Abdullah. Hear that? And number 4, Palestinians who didn't want to be ruled by the Grand Mufti. Grand Mufti's family was the Husseinis. Okay? And so basically it was a civil war among the Palestinians. And yes, they killed Jews. Yes, they killed British. Right? They tried to invade Abdullah's territory also. Mainly, or a lot, they terrorized other Palestinians. They would go to Arab villages and say, if you're not on our side, we torture you, we kill you, we burn you, this, that, and the other. And it was a terrorist campaign against their own type in order to force everybody to follow these Grand Mufti types. Pay attention to what I'm saying now, because I'll get it later. That's why, if you look at the next slide, there's a wonderful book called The Army of Shadows by Professor Hillel Cohn, I think, or Hillel Levin. And Hillel Cohn, he's a left-wing Israeli professor, historian, but he's good professionally. And he describes the whole atmosphere there in the 1930s and all the Arab internecine conflict which the Jews were able to take advantage of. Eventually, the British Army in the late 30s crushed the Intifada, but the Intifada was successful because they kept the Jews out during World War II, and that way they killed 6 million Jews. If not for an Intifada, maybe 1 million Jews would be able to run away into Palestine. But because the Arabs have been so violent against this, all during the Second World War, tragically speaking, no Jews could get to Palestine. Very small number, as everybody knows. And just when we needed it, it wasn't there. The Mufti and his lieutenants, after the Intifada was crushed in 1939, they ran away to Hitler. They ran into Germany. And so they fled Palestine, and that means that during the Second World War, the people who are left physically in Israel, in Palestine, pro-Abdullah guys. You get it? The leaders of Intifada were out of the country. They were actually hoping Hitler would win. The Mufti guys left behind many bitter memories among their fellow Palestinians, and it was for this reason that the Mufti forces were not strong enough to fight Israel after the partition resolution in 1948 and the Israeli War of Independence, as we call it, in 1947, 48, and 49. Okay? And this is why, if you know anything at all, and I spoke about this years ago, if you know anything at all about the 1948 war, the War of Independence as they call it, once the Israeli army was formed, they crushed, they took out the Palestinians, boom, like that. Okay? They were going down big time. The Mufti and his guys were a bunch of boobs. Let's go to the next one. There's the Mufti at the top, and there's his general on the horse on the left side. These were the big losers. I'm talking from a military perspective. The Jewish generals, Yigal Allon on the left and Moshe Carmel on the right, they conquered all the territory held, can I call it the PLO? I mean, I'm being anachronistic. All the territory held by the Palestinian groups. Okay? And basically, the Jews were on a roll. And when May 14th, 1948 came out. In other words, in April of 48, when the Jews went on offensive, they took out all these Palestinian places one after the other. And as a result, if the defense of Arab Palestine had been left in the hands of the Mufti and his guys, Israel would have taken over the whole West Bank. No question about it. Now, by contrast, Abdullah's forces, what we call the Jordanian army or the Arab Legion, did quite well, especially for a small army. He only had 4,500 men. It's disgusting. Essentially, from the Arab perspective now, Abdullah saved the West Bank from the Jews. Okay? This is a very important point. So let's go to the next one. What you see over there is the old map of Israel, as we all know, which I'm sure the Biden administration is going to try to go back to. And the Arab part, what you see over there, West Bank, is simply what Abdullah was able to keep out of the hands of the Jews, not the Mufti. Now, I'll tell you where I'm going with all this. For Abdullah, switch to King Hussein, and for the Mufti, go to Arafat. That's who it is. That's how it goes. You understand? Arafat is the relative and the successor of the Mufti, and committed to a policy of zero Israel. And Hussein, King Hussein I'm talking about, and Abdullah were not committed to such a policy. So this is why the situation gets dicey. In fact, had the Arabs listened to Abdullah in 1947, you hear what I'm saying, at the time of the partition, the map would have looked different. Look here for a second at the map of Israel. And now let's look at the next map. Right? Look how much smaller Israel would have been, correct? The darker areas was assigned to Israel. So as a result of the Israeli War of 48, I won't say they doubled, but they significantly increased their territory. Abdullah said like this, "You idiots, I told you, don't fight the Jews. If we agree to the partition, let me be in charge, and a lot more area of the Arabs will be under Arabs. And by the way, the Jewish state will be unviable." Okay? So he was always very pragmatic in this way. After the 48 war, Abdullah did two things. First, he gave citizenship to all the Palestinians in the West Bank, including in the refugee camps. So Jordan was the only country to say that all the people living here are now citizens of the country of Jordan. Okay? By means, the Palestinian Arabs in the refugee camps in Egypt were not given Egyptian citizenships. Egypt said, no, let them go back to Palestine. Same thing in Syria. Same thing in Lebanon and other places. But Jordan, he said, they're members of our country. Abdullah did this so that way he can say like this, it's all part of Jordan. It's not that I'm the king of Jordan, plus I took over the West Bank. The West Bank is part of Jordan. All the people are my citizens anyway, and I give them equal voting rights with everybody else. Secondly, Abdullah sought to make peace with the new state of Israel in order to get even more land. So if you look at the next map, And you know who Abdullah was? I'm talking about in 1949, especially 50 and 51. He was negotiating with Ben Gurion. Can I point over here? Well, anyway, if you look at the West Bank, he was going to get a road. They were close to working this deal out. He was going to get a road and a little piece of karka straight up to Haifa, and on the other side, from the West Bank, straight across to the Gaza Strip. Notice he was going to get even more land out of Ben Gurion in exchange for a peace treaty. He was always thinking in these terms. Another 5 inches, another 5 inches. And he was even planning possibly to make an alliance with Israel and conquer Syria. Whew. So, the reason I'm mentioning this is because that means that if you're Israel in 1949, 1950, Israel did not have a bad border with Jordan. Okay? This is a very important point. Look at that map that you have in front of you. Look how big the border is between the blue over there, the West Bank and the Israel part. It runs around like humps, doesn't it? It's not a straight line. And so, unless you're to China, you have a huge army, you can't garrison that whole area. During 1940, 1950, there were not really terrorist attacks from the West Bank into Israel. People did go back all the time, Arabs. But they're looking for their farm, they're looking for their instruments, they want their animals back, things of that nature. That's a complicated subject, but take it from me that it was not a military threat, it was just a demographic threat. More important than anything else, from Israel's point of view, Abdullah suppressed Palestinian nationalism, delaying it by 15 years. From 1948 to 1963, approximately, it wasn't Palestinian nationalism. Nobody ever heard the word Palestinians. Okay? There's Israel and Jordan. And they split Jerusalem in half, as you know, and they split the country in half, more or less, with the West Bank on the one side and Israel on the other side. And Gomarni, you have 2 countries. That's how the 48 war worked out. And it's not like, the Palestinian people don't have a chance for national self-expression. You're in Jordan. That's your country. Okay? So that means you have no claim on the territory of Israel. Now, here it gets very complicated. On the one hand, the Palestinians in the West Bank were grateful that Abdullah had saved them from the Jews in 1948. No other Arab country did. Second of all, thanks to Abdullah's defense treaty with Great Britain, because he had one of those, the West Bank would continue to be safe from Israel. Because once it became part of Jordan, de facto, Ben Gurion knew that if he invaded, as he could have, and took over the West Bank, Abdullah would invoke his treaty with England, and England would go to war to prevent Israel from taking over the West Bank, and Israel could not afford to fight Great Britain. So it was in the advantage of the Arabs, if you're an Arab living in East Jerusalem, if you're an Arab living in Hebron, in the Triangle, Jenin, Tulkarm, Nablus, Bethlehem, and all those places. Whether you like Abdullah or not, he and his policies are keeping the Jews away. Okay? Now, therefore, because of this, the regular Arab leaders in the West Bank, and there's a lot of tribes, sheikhs, heads of clans, things like that, they elected Abdullah the king of the West Bank, and he was wise enough to co-opt them with emoluments, and I'll give you a job as an inspector of this, and school inspector, and road job. He gave everybody jobs, that way keep them on the payroll, and they'd be supporting Jordan. And the type of people I'm talking about would be the non-mufti types. The non-mufti types. So basically, the end of the War of Independence of Israel meant the triumph of Abdullah among the Arabs in Palestine and the utter collapse of the Mufti due to his incompetence. He was so angry at being iced out that he bumped off Abdullah. He didn't know how to deal with this any other way, and so he killed Abdullah. He had an assassin kill him. The hope was, this is 1951, that the assassination would lead to the breakup of Jordan, which is a precarious country, and somehow, he didn't know exactly how, a Mufti-type Palestinian state in the West Bank would emerge. He didn't know how. It wasn't a plan, it was a hope. And I can tell you right now, had Jordan broken up in 1951 with the assassination of Abdullah, Ben Gurion would have occupied the West Bank. No question about it. But then Ben Gurion would have had the problem that Israel had later on, which is what he did with all the Arabs living in the West Bank. And that would have been in 1951 at the very beginning of Israel policy. So if you want to have a nice game of what if on your Thanksgiving weekend, and you want to really be an inside baseball player in Israeli history, here's what you do. You say, what would Israel have done in 51 if they would have occupied the West Bank? Now, to many people's surprise, Jordan did not break up. And after a short period, King Hussein became the king at the age of 18. And he remained the king for almost 50 years, for 47 years, until he died from cancer. Now, as we know, King Hussein's connection with the West Bank happened in two parts. The first 15 years, before the Six-Day War from 1952 to 67, when he ruled the West Bank, and then the years after he lost the West Bank in the 67 war, right? For our purposes tonight, I'm talking about specifically the 20 years after the 67 war, from 1967 to 87, when King Hussein tried and tried and tried to get the West Bank back. Both eras are relevant to our discussion tonight. Bear in mind, as I just told you before, if you look at this map, the West Bank, the border of the West Bank is too long and twisted to be possible to make it impenetrable. Let's go to the next map. I'll show you also. Same thing. All right? Next map. Okay? You see what I'm saying? It's in war, by the way, in a matter of military tactics, if you have an overextended line, what generals will do often is they'll pull back to a straighter line and even give up territory to have a straighter line. You get it? So more economical from a military point of view. From Israel, I'm talking about from strictly military point of view, what you want is a border along the Jordan River. So you have a straight line, and that's like doable. You can sort of hold it. But look at what you're required to do if you're Israel between 1948 and 1967. You can't have that whole hump that goes down and then that little finger of Jerusalem coming out. It's a nightmare. And as I say, you need a country like the Chinese army or Russian army to just be able to physically put 1 million men, or I don't know how many, 500,000 men, to really hold that line. It's impossible. So if it's not possible, then anybody can penetrate and do terrorism, right? And that's what happened. Now, you could disagree with what I said. Ariel Sharon actually built a wall in our lifetime around that long hump, right? Let's go to the next slide. You know what I'm talking about. Look on the lower left-hand side of that slide. That's the wall that any of us who have been in Israel can see. And so he said, son of a gun, we can do it, right? And you see the map of the wall, the separation wall as they call it. And it's quite, from the engineering perspective, it's quite a job. And that's because Sharon said, when he was prime minister in the 21st century, at the time of George Bush Jr., once there's already a Palestinian state of some kind or another, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, you have all these, like the shows, you know what I mean? I forget what they call them. Where the terrorists come in, and how do you stop them? You got to physically have a wall. I might say, if we go to the next slide, that Ariel Sharon inspired Donald Trump. Right? Because Trump said, I guess, you want to keep the Mexicans out, you got to build a wall. Now, it didn't happen, but the idea was Israel can do it. Now, really, that's not true. Because as we learn now, the bad guys can tunnel under the wall. Let's go to the next one. You read these headlines all the time, like I do. Cross-border tunnel discovered last month was the deepest ever found. This is from a month ago, from October 2020. Literally a month ago. You know what that means? Every time there's a weapon, then there's a countermeasure. What do they call it? Counterweapons, countermeasures. So you build a wall, you go under the wall. So you tell me, well, then I'll dig down the wall, So it goes like constantly that kind of a business. That kind of who can outdo who. 65 years ago, there was not going to be a wall in the open Gory in Israel. It's beyond imagination. So from Israel's point of view, the West Bank border was a gigantic nightmare. In the beginning, when terrorism really started to go across the border, and Israel just was not possible to have a policeman every square inch to block it, and they couldn't build a wall. So as you may possibly recall, as we see in the next slide, Ben Gurion and Moshe Dayan tried a reprisal tactics, okay? There's the young Ariel Sharon forming the commando squad to go in and wipe out Arab villages. I say wipe them out. But in the long run, putting aside the morality of it, in the long run, Israel came to realize this was not a good idea to destabilize the royal regime in Jordan, because that was the best of all possible alternatives. Eventually, it dawned on Ben Gurion and those guys, if we knock out King Hussein, what's going to take over? It's not going to be better. It's going to be worse. And if we go and blow up parts of the West Bank, which are under King Hussein's territory, and we weaken his regime and bring the public to look at him as a wimp or something like that, he's going to fall from the throne. And they'll be worse off than we were in the first place. For his part, King Hussein always understood from day one he was not strong enough to defeat Israel. On the contrary, whenever there was a clash between the IDF and the Jordanians, it damaged King Hussein. After the Sinai campaign in the 50s, and specifically after an incident in Ramat Rachel, the border became and remained quiet. I know you don't remember this, but there was, Ramat Rachel in the outskirts of Jerusalem was near, on the other side was Jordan in those days. And a Jordanian soldier lost it and started shooting a whole bunch of archaeologists, if I remember correctly, coming out of a conference, totally peaceful, and killed a whole bunch of people. And Israel said at that time to Hussein, he says, if this ever happens again, we're going in, we're taking this out. And Eisenhower's not going to stop us, because this was just murder. And Hussein saw that they really mean it, and he clamped down, and that's my point, he could, and there were no more incidents like that. So the late 50s and early 60s is the golden years in the memory of Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin and people like that, in which the West Bank was not a problem. You get it? Because the Jordanians themselves were holding the people back, because the Jordanians are afraid of Israeli reprisals. All right? This also, by the way, so in other words, what I'm trying to say is, as you see in the next map, there was a border. Those who are old enough will remember this is a street in Jerusalem, and one side of the street was Arab, one side of the street was Israeli, and there was a lot of tension, but there wasn't shooting really. Once in a while, but bederech klal, shall we say like this. Life went on, and by the standards of the Middle East, it was peaceful. You didn't have daily terrorist threats for quite a while. It also, by the way, this period corresponded with a bunch of Nasserist attacks on King Hussein, which kind of drove him into the arms of Israel secretly. And I've discussed this in the past also. If you look at the next map, starting in the very early 60s, King Hussein secretly met with Israeli diplomat Yaakov Herzog, who was the Director General of the Prime Minister's Office, and later Director General of the Foreign Ministry. That was the son of Rav Herzog. And they met at King Hussein's dentist. You'll be shocked to hear that King Hussein had a Jewish dentist in London. Frankly, I've never heard of a non-Jewish dentist. But anyway, and they had a lot of meetings. And this was unique because that's the year when the Arabs hated Israel. And so to actually have secret meetings with a leading Arab head of state could have gotten them killed. For Israeli security officials of that era, the late 50s and early 60s, the status quo was optimal. The border was basically quiet, and there was no Palestinian nationalism. So let's say it's the year 1959, for example. There's no Arafat, there's no PLO, none of that stuff. There's just Jordan on the other side. The king of Jordan is making sure through his army and secret police that nobody's crossing the border and killing Israelis. They hate the Jews, and Jews say, all right, that's like I said, it's the Middle East. But from a day-to-day perspective, if you can go about your business, that's considered Gan Eden. You understand? The image of an optimal situation, in my opinion, and this is important for our discussion tonight, became hardwired into the mentality of the Zionist left as the good times. These, when, Shimon Peres was, I remember the 50s, the late 50s, it was good, you see? Or Rabin or Dayan. Now, all during these years, there was a mufti type element in the West Bank, but this element had to lay low or risk being suppressed by King Hussein's army, police, or Mukhabarat, his, KGB, who were after them. Not because they want to protect Israel, but because these elements, the mufti types, were a threat to King Hussein. So in other words, the interests of Israel and Hussein kind of coincided. Indeed, every once in a while, these mufti elements, inspired by Nasser, I might point out, tried uprisings in the West Bank, but they were brutally suppressed by artillery at times. This is before you had, what am I thinking of, the YouTube and Google, and therefore, Jordanians could bring a bunch of tanks of a hill over a city and bombard the city until the uprising was over, and that was the end of that. Now, as far as Israel is concerned, Hussein was doing their job for them. And then things changed in the early 60s. In 1964, the PLO was founded, and so was Al-Fatah, that's Arafat's group. In 1965, Arafat's group, Al-Fatah, began carrying out terrorist attacks from the West Bank into Israel, lots and lots of them. It became crazy. They were blowing up buildings in Jerusalem. You understand? They were sneaking over the border. I remember they killed a girl in Vagan. They blew up a building near the Tachana Merkazit. No, it became crazy, okay? These were outsiders who were doing this. These were mufti types, as I call them, or Arafat types, as you can call them now. Not pro-Hussein residents who just wanted a quiet life. The attacks in Jerusalem freaked out the Israelis, and although they knew better, they knew it wasn't King Hussein doing it, they responded in an old-fashioned way, like in the 1950s, and they blew up an Arab village named El Samua, and this hurt Hussein and helped Al-Fatah, because it's all look how weak Hussein is. The Israeli raid into the West Bank, which is the first one since the 50s, led to big riots in the West Bank against Hussein, and that was not in Israel's interest. President Johnson, look at the next one, at that time called up Eshkol and said, why did you go against Hussein again? What exactly is your interest in undermining him? I want to understand this. In the midst of all this turmoil and confusion, the Six-Day War unexpectedly broke out, as we know, and Israel conquered the West Bank, but the question was now what? Israel's occupation created a new dynamic, including the problem what to do with the large Arab population in the West Bank. Although Israel wished the land was there and not the people, and the Palestinians wished the same thing about the Jews, Lamaisa, what was to be done? Now, King Hussein kicked himself for joining the war against his better judgment, but he did so. Right? So I want to be clear about this. King Hussein was there for about 50 years. He went to war against Israel once, and he wasn't crazy about doing it. He got swept up in the whole Arab enthusiasm in May and June of 1967, and boy did he pay a price. And so he always said to himself, why did I do that? Okay? Now, soon after the war, King Hussein restarted his secret discussions with Israel, often flying solo into Israel to talk to Israelis. And when his guard said like this, how can you go by yourself? You're not even carrying a gun. He said, Israel's the safest place in the Middle East for me. The one place I don't have to worry about anything is among the Jews. They're going to guard me better than you will. You know what I'm saying? They're going to treat him like an esrog, as they call it over there. So he didn't have nothing to worry about in Israel. It's when they get back to Jordan, he goes to Arab countries, that they're always trying to kill him. I mean, always trying to kill him. He basically said to the Israelis, let's go to the next one. Right. He basically said to the Israelis, give me back the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. I got to get everything back. Got to get everything back. But in return, I'll make a real peace treaty, like a Savta-type peace treaty with Israel, and I mean it. So you, Israel, will get a secure border. Isn't that what you're looking for? And it will be like before the war, except this time Israel will have a better deal. Before the war, there was we were at war. You couldn't go in the West Bank and vice versa. Now it'll be like two normal countries. It'll be good, right? Israel did not agree, as you and I know, to hand over the West Bank to King Hussein during those years for a number of reasons. First of all, from 1967 to 70, he didn't control his own country. That's the PLO uprising and the civil war that erupted in 1970. And for those years, Arafat came very close to taking over Jordan. So Hussein was not in a position in 1967 or 8 or 9 to say, give me the West Bank and everything will be good. They say, you don't even control Jordan, you see? But after 1970, he did. Even after 1970, Israel wanted the land. They just didn't want the people. And so they wanted to make a partition of the land, and they couldn't agree. Israel could not bring itself to agree to give back everything to Hussein. And they kept trying to barter him down. Here's a classic Alon plan. If you look at the colors over there, the blue and the purple, whatever it is, on the right side of it would be half the West Bank would go to Israel, would be annexed by Israel. That's the part that didn't have much of a population. And the other part, the green part, would be the part where you have the population, let them rule themselves. So King Hussein said, I can't do that, right? If I do that, I'll be overthrown. I'll be a traitor. I got to get everything back. If I get everything back, I can sell to the other Arabs. It's true. They wouldn't have said you're a sellout. The other Arab countries would have said, listen, he got his country back, he did what he had to do. Number 3, Israel feared what would happen if he was overthrown. You never knew with him. He went through all these different types of threats. I would say the throne of King Hussein was existentially precarious. He himself, I remember this as a kid, wrote an autobiography when he was a young man, and the title of the autobiography was Uneasy Lies the Head That Wears the Crown, which is from Shakespeare, right? Now, in which he talked about all the assassination attempts by Arabs against him. And finally, in the course of after the 67 war, you actually had to start the movement of Eretz Yisrael shleimah. A lot of Jews said like this, why do we want to get back Eretz Yisrael? You know that? There was that dynamic. Now, then came the shock of the Yom Kippur War, which Hussein did not join, and Hussein warned Golda Meir is coming. You hear what I said? Hussein told Golda Meir, get ready, you're going to have a surprise attack. She did not believe him. That's unbelievable, right? In the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, when Israel basically got a kick in the teeth, it was clear to all that Israel would have to start giving up land. This is the era as we see in the next slide of Kissinger, right? The only question was how much land in exchange for what? How much land and in exchange for what? Now, King Hussein, and Kissinger pushed this, said to Kissinger from day one, give me the West Bank and I'll make a full peace treaty. You know, you and I, especially today, when I'm speaking now at the end of November of 2020, so we've seen in our lifetime a peace treaty with Egypt, a peace treaty with Jordan, talk about later. Very recently under Donald Trump, it's breaking out everywhere. It's the UAE, it's Bahrain, now they're talking about Sudan, possibly Saudi Arabia. If Trump will be reelected, who knows? In other words, to us, it's just like an interesting news item. At that time, in the 1970s, no Arab country would consider or verbalize the possibility of making a full, complete peace treaty with Israel. And King Hussein said, I am, so why don't you give me the West Bank back? Okay? In the, and he said, I mean it, and he did mean it. In the aftermath of the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, Rabin was the prime minister at that time, who were now the leaders of Israel, were willing to talk. So not necessarily to agree in the full terms of Hussein, we'll never know. Kissinger, President Nixon, President Ford, constantly said to Israel in those years, Hussein is your best bet. He genuinely wants peace. And anyway, if you don't deal with him now, Arafat will bypass him and take over. And you want to deal with Arafat? And by the way, during this time when Israel was not dealing with Hussein, let's go to the next one. Arafat achieved tremendous international political and diplomatic triumphs. On the left-hand side, you see him at the Rabat conference, in which all the Arab states rejected Jordan and said Jordan is not really legitimately the one who should be the ruler of the West Bank. Only the PLO. The language was they're the only sole legitimate representative, but what they're saying is that the fact that Jordan held the West Bank for 19 years doesn't mean anything. Palestinians want to be their own boss, and Arafat should be the leader and not King Hussein. And on the right-hand side, as you all see, remember, he got a tremendous reputation in the United Nations, right? If you look at that picture very closely, under his jacket towards the back, you see a pistol. He's going in the United Nations like mafia style. You get it? This is who you're dealing with Arafat. Now, and then he said, oh, I want peace, you know. Anyway, and Kissinger writes in his memoirs, he said, you know, I warned the Israelis that either make a peace treaty with Jordan and do the whole thing now, or events will overtake you and then you'll be worried about Arafat. It'll be worse. Rabin and Peres were actually ready to dicker with King Hussein. The reason it didn't happen during their 3 years in office, because remember they were there from 74 to 77, is because they were fully busy with the Egyptian track. In other words, the Second Sinai disengagement, which was very complicated and fraught with crises, and finally came about in 1975. And then Israel was really focusing on Sadat, you understand? But it was the plan of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres to move forward on the Hussein track and negotiate a withdrawal from the West Bank in exchange for a peace treaty as soon as they were re-elected in 1977. Jimmy Carter, the new American president, was counting on this when he met with Rabin in this famous picture over here in March of 1977. I mean, as far as Carter and Rabin were concerned, it's just a question of when Israel's going to pull out of the West Bank and it's going to go to Jordan. But then in May, unexpectedly, Menachem Begin got elected, and then he got re-elected 4 years later, and the Jordanian option was blown out of the water because the home basius of Menachem Begin was a rejection of Jordanian option. He said, I don't want King Hussein. First of all, it doesn't belong to him. Second of all, it belongs to us. Third of all, it'll put Israel under mortal danger. And therefore, Begin was elected pretty heavily by voters who were afraid of pulling out of the West Bank and trusting the Jordanians. That was like a key element in his re-election. I myself remember when Begin got elected in 77, he went in to meet the press. Remember he said, meet the press? And the reporters, you know, were hostile and all that. And they said to him something like, are you going with the Jordanian option? No. He says, but Israel government, your predecessors were all committed to carrying the Jordanian option. He said, that's why we had an election. And I ran against it. And that's called democracy. I'm against it. That's why I was put in place. Now, meanwhile, that's what the policy of the next 7 years. During that time, Arafat and the PLO gained success after success internationally in getting themselves accepted as the people with whom you have to negotiate. In other words, if you want to know what's going to be with the West Bank, Gaza, and all that, you got to talk to Arafat, not to King Hussein. But for 7 years, Menachem Begin and his successor, Yitzhak Shamir said, no way. And Begin said, Arafat another Hitler, you get it? And as long as America backed the Israeli government, the PLO was effectively shut out. It drove them crazy. They set up embassies in every country in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. Obviously, the communist countries. Arafat was the darling of the press. He was courted and all this kind of stuff. And tremendous pressure was put on Israel to deal with Arafat. But you got the wrong guy with Begin. He said no, 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 and once again, no. Lo mit den Aleph, as they say. Now, and he was eloquent about it. He said, I'm not going to get back to Hitler. Arafat is a killer of children. All which is true, And he just set up a state which would be a cancer. He'll try to launch in other words, he said that Arafat would turn the West Bank into what Hamas has turned to Gaza Strip. And he was 100% correct. But now, we're up to 1984. It's the mid-80s. And the return of Peres and Rabin to power. The Israeli government was now headed by people whose analysis was different. And listen, Yitzhak Rabin was a great general. Shimon Peres was an important defense official. Unfortunately, had a krum hashkafa, as we would say today. Their analysis was Israel has to extricate itself from the problem of the occupied territories. That's what they saw. That these territories were a burden on the army, on the morale, on the economy. The problem was that as Israel pulled out, everybody realized Arafat would jump in. And Israel's security situation would become a nightmare. So the problem was how to pull out without Arafat jumping in. The only answer is Jordan. I hope I haven't confused you. I don't think so. Now, this had nothing to do with the democratic will of the people in the West Bank. This is where, give me a minute to discuss where glittering generalities clash with realities, as we would say in college in a philosophy graduate course, a course in political philosophy. Let's examine this for a minute. Let's go past journalistic vapidity and banality. Here we go. As an American, are you in favor of democracy? Of course. Well, what if the people vote for Hitler? So genocide becomes a democratically chosen policy. In other words, Hitler, let's say, for example, I'm making this up, Hitler ran on a platform of genocide. And let's say he ran in America and won fair and square, right? Would he then be legitimate? Could he go and kill everybody? In other words, is democracy the supreme value in politics? I mean, the freely expressed will of the majority? What if the majority decides to kill the minority? So I'm asking political science questions. Are you a Democrat? You favor democracy everywhere? Or do you say, Mida Kisa, that the very concept of majority rule implies, now listen closely, implies the obligation of the minority to abide by the majority will, but it also implies that one day in the future there will be another election in which the current minority may become the majority, and it will then be up to the current majority, which will then be the minority, to abide by the new majority. If you accept this principle, it implies an obligation of the majority not to take advantage of temporary success and murder the minority, hoping thereby to ensure the minority will never come to power. You understand what I mean, right? Now, in other words, the supreme commitment must be to the process. And the process implies protection and safety of the other side, protection and safety of your political opponents. So don't give me this business, well, let's have a vote, all the Arabs will vote in, they'll come in and they'll say, now let's kill Israel. That's not democracy. Oh, yes, it is. See, democracy is not the counting of noses. That's what I'm saying. Democracy, if you scratch a little bit, don't be banal, don't be vapid. Okay? Don't be superficial. Democracy is not only about how many people voted for this. That's important, but it's not only about that. The protection of the minority. Experience in the 20th century has shown that this works, when it works, in a homogeneous society, and not in a place where various antagonistic ethnic and racial groups cohabit the same political jurisdiction. It's all through the third world. This tribe versus that tribe, one tribe is a little bigger than the other tribe. Well, they'll win the government and they'll kill the other tribe, which has happened in Africa, right? Or they'll kill a political opposition, which happened in other countries. All these radical Muslim situations, they wouldn't have a vote. They want to then bring in the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they'll kill the opposition. So they'll know, one vote, one man, once, as Bernard Lewis once put it. By the way, this is an existential threat, I'm sorry to say, to the USA, which is why, as you look at the next slide, we need a unifying culture, and not the reverse of unifying culture. America is a multi-ethnic country. It's a multi-racial country, as we all know. So what unites us and prevents us from becoming shvatim that claw at each other? A unified national narrative. You see? Now, you can get rid of Robert E. Lee, maybe. If you get rid of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and all the rest, you don't have a narrative. If the founding fathers were a bunch of mamzerim who were slave owners and this, that, and the other, then the whole America was conceived in sin. And Abraham Lincoln was also bad. Remember, some people want to knock down Lincoln's statue also this past summer when they all went nuts? What you're doing is then you're destroying the glue. And if there's no glue, then it turns into impossible to have a democracy, a functioning government. Now let's apply this to the Arab-Israeli conflict, where you have two conflicting nationalities or ethnicities with an important difference. The Jews are not out there to wipe out the Palestinians, but the Palestinians are out there to wipe out the Jews. That's a fact. Now, if you're Shimon Peres and Ronald Reagan in 1984, you start by asking, what is the will of the population in the West Bank? It is to get the Israelis out of the West Bank. But then, to go on and complete the job by eliminating Israel. Such is the popular will. It has not changed since the days of the Mufti. So if we simply pull out and let events take their natural course, Rabin would say, a situation poisonous to Israel would emerge. And then what? So is that a policy? In other words, to hell with democracy. I do not favor, Israel could say, any political situation, any political system that results in my destruction. Hear what I just said? I'm not in favor of any political system that ends with me being killed. Call it democracy, shmonocracy, monarchy, whatever you want. I don't like anything in which I end up getting killed. Now, in other words, Reagan and company, by the way, these BDS guys and the Peter Biner guys who say Israel should be dismantled, you say, if Israel's dismantled, what happens to all Jews living in Israel? Well, I don't know. They're going to get killed. Well, I don't know. You see what I'm saying? This is obscene. Okay, it's not a political opinion. It's obscene. Now, therefore, Ronald Reagan and company realized, they're not stupid, they realized quite clearly that contrary to the mantras of world opinion, complete withdrawal from the West Bank would not result in Middle Eastern peace. Quite the opposite. It'd be an Arafat state, and that would lead to bigger wars like you have now with the Gaza Strip. This is precisely indeed what happened in the Gaza Strip when the politics cannot be controlled from the outside and the population voted for Hamas. Right? Let's go to the next one. Hamas came to power in 2006 or 2007, whatever it was, democratically. Okay, so that means the population, democratically, in the Gaza Strip says, we're voting for a party that wants to wipe out Israel. So what do I say? I said, well, if that's the democratically, chosen will of the people of Gaza, I guess Israel must self-destruct, commit suicide, because it's the democratic will. You see the problem with using democratic mantras in what I call a vapid and banal way, okay? Did Israel, as you see, regain? This is the hit not quit, we all remember, the withdrawal under Ariel Sharon. He said, if Israel pull out, then you'll have peace. Did Israel gain peace or improve its security by withdrawing from Gaza Strip in 2006? Or has Gaza turned into a radioactive cancer for Israel? So if Israel can't stop withdrawal and create an Arafat state, what do you do? I mean, if you're Ronald Reagan and you are genuinely committed to three goals, you really are. Number one, to secure Israel. Reagan was pro-Israel. A democratic Palestinian state in the West Bank. And an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These are what you call Tartet Savta. They're mutually exclusive. What do you do? What is your thinking? What is the best thinking of the State Department? I mean the State Department under George Shultz, who was a good guy, and so they mean good for Israel and everybody. They're trying to come up with the best solution. So it's the kind of thing you can throw at Joe Biden also. What do you do in terms of settling the Arab-Israeli conflict and setting up a Palestinian state of any kind in the West Bank if it'll lead to another Gaza Strip? What is your position on that? Now the answer was, be mavater on pure democracy. Instead, be more narrow legalistic and go for King Hussein. So have Israel negotiate withdrawal, King Hussein will take over. It will be sort of democratic, there will be an Arab leader, and most importantly, it will not result in an Arafat state, because Reagan knew an Arafat state is another Cuba. But on the other hand, will it bring peace to the Middle East? No. The PLO will fight it, and King Hussein will be branded a sellout, and things will get ever more complicated. So what's the point? That was the position of Likud. You see? Here you have the dividing line. But Shimon Peres and company and King Hussein refused to look at it that way, and still do. To them, the ikar is to get the Israeli GIs, the grunts, out of the way in the West Bank to relieve these Jewish boys of garrisoning a hostile population with the necessary roughness that goes along with occupation, because it does. And to Shimon Peres, who was always an optimist, the Jordanian thing will work out. King Hussein's secret police, the Mukhabarat, will crush the Arafat guys with an iron hand, because anybody knows anything about Jordan knows it's a police state with a velvet glove over it. Hussein will do this because the Arafat guys are a mortal threat to him, literally. They have tried numerous times to assassinate him. My favorite story is when the Mossad called up King Hussein. It's like this: don't take the nose drops. He's about to take the nose drops. He said, what's the problem? Put the nose drops in the sink. They put the sink, acid, burned the hole through the sink. So he said, Mossad, thank you very much. Okay, this is what you're dealing with. Thus, Israel will be the collateral beneficiary of the Jordanian occupation of the West Bank, and Ronald Reagan will make sure that it comes with a full peace treaty so that the Jews can enter the West Bank, not settle, but at least go there, visit there, pray there. There can be economic cooperation. Not perfect, but pretty good. So basically, this was a optimistic pipe dream. Okay? As for Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, how are you going to work that out? Because King Hussein says, as a Muslim, I got to get back to Har Bayis. I got to get everything. Maybe, the Jews can go to the Kotel, but I got to get everything else back. Peres was optimistic. It can be worked out. This was his approach. The Likud, of course, said, you're nuts. Mikama bechinot. This will never work for a bunch of reasons. Are you really going to surrender the Temple Mount? That's the kind of Jew you are. I remember I was once in Israel in 1996. Happened to land there on the day of the elections, the day before the elections. I actually participated in the elections. That's another story. I came there the day before the elections, and I went for a conference in the Hebrew, and they had a big billboard right outside the airport. Peres Yimkor Imo. Peres would sell his own mother. You understand? So are you really going to sell the Har Bayis? Second of all, can you really rely upon Jordan to resist the Arab street? Notice if there'll be a peace treaty, and the whole Arabs will rise up like this, like happened to King Abdullah in 1947, and happened to King Hussein in 1967, when they couldn't resist the popular will to go to war against Israel. This is what you're relying on? You think Jordan will be able to resist such a tidal wave of Arab hatred of Israel leading to conflict? Number C, are you doing King Hussein a favor? He's going to be swallowing a hornet's nest. Okay? A big population doesn't warn him. Right? Can he control it? And what happens if he's overthrown? Well, as I said, Shimon Peres and Ronald Reagan said, we will work it out. We will work it out. We will work it out. So what happened next? I think that's enough for one night, frankly. We went a long time. And so we'll pick this up next time. Hope springs eternal in the Middle East. Have a good Bach. Thanksgiving weekend will be over by the time you see this. And so enjoy the rest of your weekend.